Okay, if you remember, a few years ago, for quite a few years actually, I've always ran this event at church called the Amazing Race, okay? And so what that was, it was a day-long scavenger hunt across the whole city where you work together in teams and you figure out riddles and you complete challenges and so on. And it was a lot of work, but the reason I put so much work into that was because in my church in Vancouver when I was a kid, my favorite memories were of Amazing Race, right? My favorite Amazing Race ever was back in 2010. I was teamed up with this tall, handsome man named Vincent. We're super athletic, look at us. We're ready. The only thing was we got teamed up with two really lazy, non-competitive girls, okay? Like the one with like long nails and they were like all they were wearing makeup for some reason. I was just like, okay, cool. Like, we're done for it. We can't win. We're nerfed, right? But we tried our best anyways. And so after the first location, we called into the organizer and we asked him, hey, like, we're probably last place, but like, be honest, how are we doing? And he was like, you're actually in first place. And we're like, whoa, what? And what was happening is that we were figuring out the riddles really fast, okay? And so me and Vincent, we're kind of like celebrating, and then we did what anybody would do next. We turned to our girls and we told them we're in last place. That we needed to pick up the pace, right? We got to start running, and we did this to them the whole day. So we gaslighted them the whole day to the point they're like, if we're last place already, why are we even trying anymore? Like, I don't want to run anymore. We're like, no, let's get like sixth place at least, right? By the end of it, to their surprise, we were the winners by a long shot, by like an hour, right? And we're like celebrating together, and we're looking at each other, and you can tell by their look, it's like, I'm happy we won, but I'll never trust you again. And it's like, whatever, like we won, right? Anyways, during this race, there was another group, okay? They had the opposite approach to this race. So they called in after the first location. I think they were like third place or something, and they're like, sweet, we're not last or anything, let's take our time, okay? So what they did was they had like a huge, long lunch, and then after lunch, they got itis. So itis is where you get tired after eating a big lunch, and then they just rested. One guy, he just took off his shirt and laid on the sidewalk of a busy road, right? Broadway, if you guys know. He just laid there, right? And it's just like, why did he take off his shirt to lay on cement? I don't know. And then soon after that, the team actually disbanded. So it's just like, dang, right? The craziest thing about the story is that they told everyone else that the event wasn't fun, even though other 6 teams had a blast, right? And it's kind of like, well, obviously it wasn't fun. You didn't even participate. You just like laid on the street, right? And I share this story because there's a parallel to Christian life. When the Christian life is lived well and we actually participate and take in what God is offering through Jesus, it's the super awesome and rewarding adventure. It gives us purpose, it makes us grow, it brings people together, but it's very common for Christians to completely miss the point. You could say that they lose their way. So we're going to address this in hopes that we'll have a better chance of staying on track. So our question today is, how do Christians lose their way? I believe 2 very common mistakes we should be wary of are. The first one is we can be distracted by pleasure. And the second one is we can be discouraged by pain. In our story today, we get to see 2 outstanding Christians resist the temptations of pleasure and pain, of praise and persecution, right? And so for the past few weeks, we were looking at Paul's transformation from being this elite Christian killer, like a serial killer, to an elite Christian leader, like a serial leader, right? And last week, David talked about the church of Antioch sending out their best leaders, Paul and Barnabas, to spread the good news of Jesus to a bunch of different cities. And one day, they came across a crippled man who's been crippled since birth, and they healed him in a spectacular way in the city of Lystra. And the people who saw this, the people who witnessed it, they were amazed, right? They were mind blown. They're like, how'd you even do that? And they came to the wrong conclusions. So let's read. It's from Acts 14, 11 to 18. When the crowd saw what Paul had, The gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas, they called Zeus, and Paul, they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. The priests of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human, like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. This is where our first point comes in. We can be distracted by pleasure. After getting married, I found out something. I found out I had a superpower. Crazy, right? One that was there all along, but no one ever knew about it. Until Christine discovered it, and she started sending me on special missions, right? And this is what my superpower is. Don't be too amazed. All glory to God. I'm a super focused grocery shopper. Okay, super focused, okay? You give me a list of things to buy, I will go to Superstore, and I will buy only those things. Amazing, right? Amazing, I know. And it would take me less than 10 minutes sometimes. And apparently, this is impressive because when Christine goes, it's a whole event, right? She'll open up her schedule, like 2-3 hours, right? She'll peruse up and down every single aisle. And then even though she just came from milk and eggs, she'd leave with a cart full of things, right? From Superstore. Anyways, the internet has revealed to me that I'm not so special. The superpower exists among most men. It's a universal difference between a lot of men and women. There's this next slide. How men do shopping. That's their grocery. That's milk and eggs. How women do shopping, right? And it's like, okay, didn't know that. Anyways, it's just a fun example to say it is so easy to be distracted by attractive and shiny things. For things like grocery shopping, it doesn't really matter if you get distracted, right? It maybe even makes unless you're spending too much money, it's breaking your bank, but it even makes it more enjoyable sometimes. Sometimes especially during COVID, I enjoyed going grocery shopping because I got to leave the house, right? But what about the bigger things in life? Like your relationships, like your schooling, future career, your family, and most of all, your faith. For things like that, they'll throw your whole life off course if you're distracted, right? Our Bible story today has a huge example of being distracted by pleasure. And so, we'll put the context here. Paul and Barnabas, their ministry before this event has been terrible, right? Like, they've been rejected and persecuted for sharing Jesus to people to the point that their lives were always in danger. They're always in danger of dying. And put yourself in their shoes. That's really tiring and stressful. But in our story today, it was the complete opposite, right? After doing a miracle, the people around them went wild because they thought Paul and Barnabas were gods. And imagine how nice it would be after getting rejected all the time to finally have people love you and praise you, offer you all sorts of riches. You have the authority of gods, right? All the pleasures you could ever ask for in their hands. And the temptation that Paul and Barnabas are facing, I think it's actually quite similar to our everyday temptations, right? We might have it better than the gods, okay? Our lifestyle these days are actually more prosperous, luxurious, and enjoyable than God's back in the ancient Greek days, right? Think about it. We don't even have to worry about actual needs, right? Like, most of our needs are wants, right? And it's just like, dude, that's a really good problem to have, even though we're super stressed about it, right? We're surrounded by thousands of things that promise us pleasure. I think we are actually the most distracted generation of all time. People back then, or maybe even 100 years ago, they would be mind blown by the access we had to things like Netflix and online shopping, YouTube, video games, foods, romances, through dating apps, and even the ability to travel leisurely, right? And I'm not saying these things are bad. I'm not saying they're bad. I think it's a blessing, and it's something to be grateful for, but these things come with a heavy risk of being completely derailed from the whole faith and mission in life, because it's so easy for these things to become more important than godly things. But there's a way to defeat this temptation. It's to have our attention captivated by something even more attractive. In one of his letters, Paul reflects on the life he left behind when he met Jesus. And this is his revelation. But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Jesus, or Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage that I may gain Christ. That's a crazy revelation. What is Paul saying? Paul's saying that all the things that he used to chase after, all the things that brought him pleasure, all the things that he spent his whole life investing into, compared to Jesus, that's garbage. That's disposable stuff. That's things that you throw away and don't even want to touch compared to what you have now. And I do think that is why Paul and Barnabas were easily able to resist the temptations of living like gods. Instead, they were mortified. What did they do in our story? They ripped their clothes. That's a sign of grief. They went into the crowds to stop the worship, right? They were so captivated by the gospel and its saving effect that they didn't even stop to think about the pleasures being offered to them. And then let's think about this a little bit deeper, right? At the core of it, what's going on? I think they're asking themselves, what would it cost them if they were to give up the mission of spreading the gospel and instead live a life of pleasure? Not only would they be giving up Jesus and the reward promised to them, but they'd be stealing from other people's chances to know Jesus and to have eternal life as well. It's way too costly for them to chase pleasure. Now for us, for our pleasures and our luxuries, what is it costing us? What is it costing others? I've been playing this game for the past 3-4 months, and it's called Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So I can learn more about like the Greek culture, yeah. But I looked, there's this thing where you save it, and they show you how long you've been playing. For the past 4 months, I've been playing for like 60 hours. And I'm like, dang, what is this costing me? Like, okay, what am I gaining from it? Oh, I get to kill time. What am I costing for it? Like, probably friendships and the ability to like reach souls and do kingdom work and all that stuff, right? And to invest in my family, yeah, it's just like, I don't think it's worth it, right? We need to get into the habit of thinking this deeply and critically when we are faced with the choice between Jesus and earthly pleasures, right? And it's not that we stay away from all these good things in life, but rather we let them take their place as tools in our life to gain the things of eternity. The idea is that we're trading good things for infinitely better things. And that's how we defeat the distraction of pleasure. But there's an opposite temptation that Christians deal with, which leads me to my second point. We can be discouraged by pain. As we continue on in our passage, we see a very painful experience for Paul and Barnabas. And here are verses 19 and 20. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and he went back to the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. I think there's something really profound here about the reality of potential worldly pleasures. It's that the very thing promising us pleasures and satisfaction in life can instantly become the thing that destroys your life, right? The crowds went from worshiping to stoning the apostles within one verse. That's a quick twist, right? And the whole experience, it just screams pain in so many different ways, right? There was the social pain of being rejected by the people who were just so in love with you, right? There was the anxiety of knowing that people were out to get you no matter where you went. And there was the very, very real pain of having like big rocks thrown at you until you like look like you're dead, right? That's That's painful, right? For me, I feel like I'd stop there, right? If I survived that, I'd probably just go home and hide out in my room so I never get hurt again. But for Paul and Barnabas, what's remarkable is that they didn't stop. They got stoned to death, and then they went back into the city, probably to heal up, probably to say some last words to the guy they just healed. And then they continued on the next day to keep on spreading the gospel, where they knew there would be more and more trouble. And they could do that because they knew why they were suffering, and they knew that it was worth it. In the homeless shelter I used to work at, I had the privilege of just sitting at tables and talking to a lot of people. And I've heard so many different worldviews. A lot of them were Christian worldviews, but with a twist, right? It's like they'll give a varying belief about what the Bible actually says. And usually they're like the Messiah or something, but I don't know. Okay, but there's another very common belief, and it was this, okay? They looked at their lives, and they saw that it was suffering. So this is their conclusions, right? If they're suffering, then there's no good God. If there's no good God, then everything is a chance random accident. If everything is an accident, then life has no meaning, no purpose. If life has no meaning or purpose, then the only thing we should do with life is to make it the greatest party ever before we disappear from existence. And based off of this belief, a lot of the stories make sense, right? Why some of them refuse to work, because work is no fun, right? Why some of them refuse to submit or be a sheep in the system, whatever that means. I kept hearing it, but I'm like, I don't know what that means, right? Why they can take advantage of others and not feel guilty or bad, why they can objectify women and laugh about it, why they're constantly intoxicated with a bunch of different things, right? It's this pursuit to make this meaningless life as fun and enjoyable as you can before it ends. And here's the thing. It was fun for them, obviously, for when they were up on their highs, but many of those guests were depressed, and some of them were even suicidal. I mean, it's not hard to be when you get to that place in life, right? There was one guy, he was young. He was maybe around my age, maybe younger. And he's on board with this belief that we're talking about. He's living for the highest pleasures, but all his highest highs have been met with lower lows. And so he's actually really often, he's in these really dark slumps. He's often actually making suicidal threats because he's suffering so much. He'd say that his family disowned him. He's in a toxic relationship. He is alone. He has no one. And he's constantly in physical pain from health issues and withdrawals. And every time I'm there, I'm listening to his story, I have nothing to say to him. It's just silent. All I'm saying is like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that, right? Because I want to tell him what I believe, right? I want to tell him that life is beautiful and it's meaningful, especially when you know Jesus. But if what he believes is true, then suffering is the worst thing ever, right? It's meaningless pain. That's like the worst thing ever. From his side, if we only have a few years in this world to make it the greatest party ever, and for the foreseeable future, life genuinely sucks. Right? Life genuinely sucks and you can't see any way out of it. Why in the world would you want to continue? The world doesn't have a good answer, right? The best is maybe if you stick it through, then maybe, potentially, it'll get better, but we don't know. And that's a terrible answer for someone who has no hope in their suffering. As Christians, though, we have an answer for suffering. And it's answered in the person of Jesus, right? His whole life seemed to be a series of constant sufferings of all sorts, right? He left his throne in heaven and came down as a fragile baby, born to a poor family that was accused of shameful adultery. Jesus, our God, our King, worked a blue-collar labor job growing up as a carpenter. And especially at the end of his life, any kind of suffering you can imagine, he went through it, right? Betrayed by his close friend through a kiss. Abandoned by his other friends in his darkest times, seeing the injustice of people choosing to save this guilty criminal named Barnabas over himself, who was completely innocent. Immense pain as he was flogged and crucified, and then throughout this whole process, our King of Glory was humiliated, and humiliated, right? What gave him the strength to endure it all? Why did he choose to come just to suffer? Well, the Bible gives us at least 3 answers to this question. Actually, we did a fun exercise. The Bible gives at least 11 answers to this question, but we'll name 3 and we'll focus on 1. So the first answer, we expanded our first point, right? Jesus looked forward to a joy, to a glory that was before him, one that will make his immense suffering seem like little tickles, right? The second is that he wanted to please God, and he knew that his costly sacrifice was a worthy offering to God because it showed his heart for him. But the answer I want to focus on today is that Jesus went through hell on earth for the sake of others. Right? In his love, in his glory, he suffered for others. For us following Jesus, when he's saying stuff like, take up your cross, he's not being like metaphorical and like, well, he is being metaphorical, but he's telling us to follow after him, follow in his footsteps, and suffer for others. Right? I think that's what it means to be made in God's image. That's in our best interest when we suffer for the sake of others. And what does suffering for others look like? I imagine a few different ways, right? We suffer for others when we intentionally give up our comforts and our resources for their growth, for their potential to know Jesus more deeply. OCC, I am so impressed by our church, right? Not because 8,000 is the biggest number we've ever seen, but it shows that we're willing to give up collecting and hoarding comforts and things and experiences so that someone else can have the chance of knowing Jesus, right? It's a good way to live for the gospel. Or maybe I'm just giving you guys too much credit and you just want us bald, right? Maybe that's it. But another way we suffer is when we suffer through our issues well, right? When troubles come our way, we suffer well. I don't have COVID. I'm good. So when you face hard times faithfully, you are strengthening your trust in Jesus. You are growing in empathy for others who go through the same issues. And you're gaining wisdom through a bunch of revelations in that pain, right? Essentially, what you are doing by suffering well is you're paving a path that leads to healing and restoration that you can actually one day use to guide others down when they go through the same thing. Who's ever had an issue that you felt alone in and then someone came to you and they're like, I went through this, it sucks, but here's how I got out of it? Who's ever had that? That's the best feeling ever, right? You're not alone anymore, and you have a light at the end of the tunnel. This is what we're doing right now as we're looking at the examples of Paul and Barnabas, right? We're learning how to suffer well through their example as they suffered well and faithfully. And so don't view suffering as meaningless. Use it to gain treasures in heaven, to please God, and to help others. At the beginning, we asked this question: how do Christians lose their way? First thing we saw was that they're distracted by pleasure. And so to defeat that temptation, we look to greater and eternal things promised in Jesus so that the pleasures now seem like garbage. The second thing is that we're discouraged by pain, right? That's natural. No one likes to get hurt. But how do we fight against that temptation? Focus on the reason for suffering, right? It's not meaningless. It doesn't have to be meaningless. We can suffer for gains for ourselves. We can suffer for the sake of other people.